In what follows, you will hear memories of the Covid-19 pandemic, gathered from people across the Exeter area. They are varied in their emotions and content, and some may be difficult to hear, but we think that they are so important to be shared. I remember Exeter's memory of the Covid-19 pandemic, collected and edited by David Tollerton, based on a model devised by Alec, Finlay and Joe Brainard. Read by Leah Lawford. I remember when it felt like something was coming. I remember when I first heard about a strange new virus being reported on the radio, wondering how long it would be before it reached us. I remember a few days before the lockdown announcement, being the only swimmers in a local pool, hearing the worry from staff about their jobs. I remember rushing back from the holiday of a lifetime, scrambling to get planes and buses and trains, staying awake for 30 hours. I remember our goodbye, sat with my then girlfriend in our rapidly deserting halls, having met each other on the very first day of university. I'll never forget our final hug when it was time to leave. I remember when the first lockdown was announced. I was on shift in the hospital as the news spread. We all gathered around a TV and watched in disbelief. It was like something out of a film. I remember thinking it would all be over in 6 weeks. I remember sitting on my sofa watching Boris Johnson announce the lockdowns. I cried. I felt numb and scared. The outside world was the escape and distraction from my thoughts. I wasn't sure I'd be able to cope. I remember rushing home from abroad, not knowing what would await. Shock, boredom, foreboding, grief, and loss. I remember the day we were all told to work from home, taking the office plants and monitors, and then discovering how bad my internet was. I remember a feeling of dread. Feeling like we weren't prepared as a country, and so it came to pass. I remember a letter coming through the door to tell me that I was vulnerable. This was the first time I felt truly scared by the pandemic. I remember my partner of nearly 3 years leaving me the night of lockdown. He put my key through the door at 10 p.m. I ran to the door to see him walking up the road into the foggy night. I will never forget it as long as I live. I remember the day it suddenly got quiet. I remember when my life stopped. I remember waving goodbye to my husband who worked in the ambulance service for his first shift in lockdown. His mask and PPE did not fit. My son gave him his dinosaur mask and said, "Take this, Daddy, you can roar." I wondered that day whether extinction would be all our fates. I remember the fear of stepping onto ICU for the first time in full PPE, when everything was so new and uncertain. I remember walking through the hospital one night, at the start of the pandemic. It was so quiet. I felt anxious, like I was huddled in an air raid shelter hearing the whine of the bomb above my head, waiting for it to hit, not knowing if or when it would. I remember thinking our lives were all going to change forever, and I wanted to document it. We need to remember this experience. I remember when the roar of the traffic from the motorway was gone, and it was so quiet. I remember the sun beaming down every day, with hot evenings and beautiful sunrises that always felt so peaceful. I remember walking down in the middle of Barrack Road at 2 in the afternoon with no cars, no people, no anything. I remember hearing loud, irritating sound break the heavy lockdown silence in Blackwall Road. I went to the window to see what it was. Scraping the road, in the wind, I could hear a packet of crisps. I remember the number and noisiness of sparrows in my garden, interrupting my team's calls with their enthusiastic chirping. I remember the many people who walked past the house each day, some so regularly that we gave them nicknames. I remember how first it felt nice to have some quiet, but then how desperately lonely I was. I remember walks along the river and on the Dawlish seafront, how delicious the space and fresh air were. I remember the heat in my bedroom that summer, without a garden to escape to. I remember feeling stuck, trapped in my own mind waiting to see daylight again. I needed to be outside. I remember learning how to use Zoom with the backgrounds to make my 9-month-old grandchild laugh, but that it was sad spending my 60th birthday online. I remember marching around the house trying to get in my daily 10,000 steps without ever stepping outside. I remember walking around our neighbourhood, sometimes in the middle of the road, greeting strangers and the occasional old friend. I remember early morning walks, seeing the dog roses fresh in hedgerows. I remember peering through my daughter's windows to see the grandchildren, their little faces asking, "Why is Nana out there? Can she come in?" It feels like a dream now. I remember working around the clock while others were learning Spanish and making sourdough. Next pandemic, I'm making sourdough. I remember being confined to my room, not knowing when I would see my family and friends. I remember a workplace that prided itself on telling staff to put family first, but my family were on the other side of the world. I remember not being able to hug my son on his 21st birthday. Luckily the weather was warm, so we sat on the grass outside his supported living house. I wished I could sit next to him. I remember my mental health actually being better and feeling guilty about it. I remember standing in deserted streets in Dawlish, taking photographs, never thinking of road safety. Suddenly a human nearby. Are they 2 meters away? I remember waiting with my trolley in a socially distanced queue to enter Tesco, wearing a face mask and gloves. I remember feeling extremely lonely at the start of the pandemic, beginning my first year at university in an unfamiliar place. I remember the exhilarating opportunity to cycle on the main roads without having to worry about being knocked for 6. I remember the sounds of the birds and the wild animals reclaiming their natural space, the absence of noisy cars and planes, the pure, clean air. I remember wishing we could learn some lessons for a fresh start, I remember once hoping for that. I remember the silence, the feeling of being alone in a dead city. It felt like a Hollywood disaster movie. I remember having lunch on my doorstep with neighbours every day, how it was a beautiful community. I remember the fear of applying to Exeter for university when I'd never seen the city that would become my home. I remember learning how to trim my own hair. I remember walking along country lanes with no cars. I remember limping for 9 months in lockdown because I was on a non-urgent list for treatment. I remember most the quiet at night, the clean, cool air coming in through the open window. I've never been able to sleep like that before or since. The cars are back now. The windows stay shut. The air is stale. I remember in the river by our house, building dens, nighttime fires and marshmallows, teaching my son how to fish, teaching my daughter how to play poker. And I also remember watching a friend's funeral on Skype with only 6 people attending. No friends, just direct family. A great woman, a great friend, died alone and too few people to remember her life's achievements and stories. I remember my mother looking at me, distressed by the strategically aligned plastic windows on the lawn of her care home. A week later, my dear mother was dying. I was allowed inside. I hope she recognised my voice from behind my PPE. I remember the loneliness, how this made me value connection more than ever. I hope I never take it for granted. I remember the sheer terror that some people had just turning up for work, being hot and unable to breathe properly, and not seeing a smiling face for what seemed like weeks. I remember thinking how every surface I touched could be contaminated with the virus, which I might then take back to my elderly mother. If she caught the virus, I might wave her off at a hospital and never see her again. I remember needing emergency surgery, struggling while living alone with the injuries. I'm still recovering. I remember feeling hidden behind the mask, as though we were losing the need to smile at one another, how important eyes became for communication. I remember recovering from life-saving surgery during the height of the pandemic. I was alone, stuck in the bed in an empty room with no visitors permitted, and yet the team of overworked doctors, nurses, and catering staff became family. I remember when my son's school closed, not knowing the impact it would have, how the whole arc of his childhood became misshapen and was never quite fixed. I remember my mum working in a school in the early days of COVID, having to fully shower and change before she would greet any of us after work. I remember trying to home teach the children and setting out the day like a school with breaks and set lessons. The novelty soon wore off. I remember the exhaustion. Work in the morning, helping the kids with homeschooling in the afternoon, and then in the evening watching the teaching videos for the next day so I was ready to help them. There wasn't enough of me to go round. Then I remember phoning my parents and hearing they were bored. I remember teaching small children, trying to make them feel safe, but me feeling vulnerable all the time. I remember taking over a Girl Guiding Rainbows unit, running sessions on Zoom, trying to keep the interest of girls who were tired of online lessons and just wanted normal times back. I remember crying when Ben Bradshaw was kind enough to stop and ask, "How are you?" when canvassing. I opened the door with a baby in my arms and a toddler at my side, and he said he knew how hard it had been for parents of small children. I remember having to walk into the hospital on my own, my husband waiting outside until the midwife confirmed active labour. I remember my parents not being able to hold their first grandchild. I remember the postnatal depression, with no help from friends and family. I remember how long every day with my new baby felt with nowhere to go and no one to talk to, and how sad I felt because it was so different to my expectations. I remember the utter devastation and heart-wrenching sadness at home with the closure of fertility services. I remember struggling to find icing sugar for my son's 3rd birthday cake. A stranger heard me sigh at another empty shelf and offered me an unused box from home. He took my address and left it on my doorstep. I cried at his kindness, and then baked a Gruffalo cake. I remember how people in Pinho baked and delivered over 2,000 plates of afternoon tea to our community. Each plate had at least 3 slices of cake upon a coloured napkin with a piece of fruit and a flower. I remember a delivery of emergency food with tins of rice pudding, beans, a packet of cornflakes, white sliced bread, and a very large red cabbage. I remember the WhatsApp message to the street asking if anyone had found flour or yeast. I remember clapping every week for all heroes. I remember the roller coaster of emotions in the days leading up to the admission of COVID patients to ICU. There was the fear after seeing other hospitals trying to cope with the sheer volume of admissions. We were as ready as we could be. We just wanted to do our bit. I remember when the first nurse in our unit got COVID. It was before the vaccines, and I remember how scared we were for her. I remember walking into the ward, wondering if this is the day I would be taking COVID home to my family. I remember feeling despair after being told the man doing PPE fit tests had no space prior to my impending weekend on call. I knew a resuscitation without a fitted mask meant potentially blowing COVID into my face with each compression. I was so grateful when he stayed late to complete my test. I remember feeling frightened and worried about my parents. As nurses, we knew more than the general public, which was terrifying. I remember hearing people call it just a cold. It genuinely scared me. I remember someone saying to me it was all lies, brainwashing and propaganda, all about power, money and control. I remember the eerie liminal feeling of the hospital corridors without patients or medics running around, and seeing a fox ambling around an empty car park. I remember the faces of patients whose hands I held, tears I dried, taking them outside the warehouse hospital to see daylight when they were well, clearing their chests, measuring their oxygen when they were not. Most of all, I remember my amazing colleagues who brought so much joy. I remember having mixed feelings, being a nurse. This was our war, why we had trained. My family was scared. I didn't talk about work, to not frighten them. I was grumpy and uncommunicative. Stress came from work and home. I began running miles to control my emotions. I remember when I got Covid-19 as if it were yesterday, 14th of April 2020. I never imagined the debilitating impact this would have. I had to learn how to live and work differently as a nurse, wife, and mother. 5 years on, I still manage the after effects. I remember the horrendous coughs as patients were brought in by ambulances. I saw them going past me on trolleys on their way to ICU. I was scared for me and my family, and for all my colleagues, and for the patients I encountered. After work one evening I was so overwhelmed. I sat in my car with my head on the steering wheel and cried. I remember feeling like there wasn't enough air. I remember being in the infancy of my medical training, once, when I wasn't sure what to do, just watching the incredible nurses running around. I held the hand of a dying mum, making sure she wasn't alone in her last moments. I remember when the country pulled together, day and night, with a well-earned applause for the frontline NHS workers. I remember the days when it felt like we were all in it together, and the days when it didn't. I remember feeling that the cleaners were key workers too, and shouldn't be forgotten. I remember when they said that the second lockdown was the worst sequel ever. I remember going for a walk with a friend in the freezing cold and sitting with a flask at opposite ends of a picnic bench. I remember the first and only Christmas I spent away from my family. I was on shift all day in full PPE, then went home to an empty house, but FaceTimed my family for a Christmas cheers and a well-deserved mulled wine. I remember my temporary employment as an undertaker. The work with such a caring and committed team was tempered by heartbreak, exacerbated by lockdown restrictions, witnessed firsthand every day. I remember the constant bombardment with death, terrifying numbers, numbness at the loss, deep sadness for them and their loved ones. I remember the utter disbelief at being told to prepare for the worst less than 24 hours after my previously fit and healthy father-in-law had been admitted to hospital. I remember when my sister, a nurse in ICU, wasn't expected to make it. Not being able to see her was hell. Looking back, it feels like a bad dream. I remember holding my colleague's hand as another poor patient lost their battle. We felt useless and defeated. We sobbed, we cursed, we got angry, but we had to wipe those tears and carry on. We carried on through the panic attacks, through the fear, and through the unknown. I remember the last time I saw my mother-in-law, lying dead in a hospital bed, with the next patient's name bands accidentally left at the foot of her bed, ready to be moved on. We hadn't been able to visit or say goodbye. She was so alone. I remember it was like a dream that I wish hadn't happened, as my mum passed away and I couldn't attend the funeral. I remember sitting with people who were dying alone in hospital, holding their hand and telling them how much their families loved them. I remember working in the first COVID clinic and seeing the joy on patients' faces as they received their first vaccination. Families took photos at the clinic. Such an emotional and happy experience after such uncertainty. I remember the isolation during lockdown. Volunteering at the Exeter Vaccination Centre gave me a sense of purpose. I made lifelong friends there. I remember taking my 3-year-old out of the house for the first time in 5 months. I remember when the pandemic started, but not when it ended. I guess for some people it never has. Not entirely. I remember the 29th of March 2020, 10 p.m. My world fell apart. My dad, my hero, passed away from COVID in hospital. I remember not being able to see him, not being able to give him the send-off he deserved. I remember my wonderful and kind loving mother, suffering with dementia and Parkinson's, all alone in a nursing home, isolated from her family and friends. No faces to see, just masks. Dying alone. Rest in peace, Mum. I remember sitting in my sister's garden at the beginning of lockdown, on the day we were told that Brian, our dad, was dying. We tried to console each other from 6 feet apart. We miss him so much. I remember the last text I had from my dad that I still have on my phone. 21st of March 2020. The day before he went to ICU, I told him how much I loved him and could not wait for him to be home. He sent a thumbs up and X's for kisses. That was the last time I had contact with him before he passed away from COVID. I remember being told your son, at 36, with no underlying conditions, was dead of a blood clot caused by COVID. Then I remember nothing.